Hi, how's everybody doing? Ah, what enthusiasm. We love enthusiasm here. We love yelling. You would think we would not love yelling here at the library, but in fact, you would be wrong. So, anytime you want to scream. But like friendly screaming, right? We're a very friendly place. My name is Aidan Flax-Clark. I'm the director of Live from NYPL, so I am very grateful that you're all here. Grateful to everyone who is watching online tonight. We are very lucky to have David Oppenheimer here with us tonight. He's a clinical professor. Yeah, give it up. That's right. And yelling again. Just welcome anytime you feel so moved. He's a clinical professor of law at the University of California in Berkeley and the author of the new... Wow, so much cheering. I grew up in LA, so I'm a little bit, Bruins, but, Are Berkeley and UCLA enemies or are they allies? I'm not really sure. Frenemies. Okay, all right. Better than total enemies. We're here to learn about David's new book, The Diversity Principle, the story of a transformative idea. And he is joined by none other than Van Jones, who, of course, you know. That's right. CNN's finest political commentator, among so many other things. But you have David and Van's full bios in your programs. If you're watching online, their bios are on the event page. David's book is fantastic, and what I really appreciate about it is that it brings nuance to a very, very under-nuanced subject, diversity. Getting less nuanced by the day, it feels like. His book is an incredibly thoughtful exploration of diversity about its long history in academia and elsewhere, how we have debated it, how we have made use of it, and among other things, how we have misunderstood it. And again, given the amount of sort of willful misunderstanding about diversity that seems to be impacting policy, this seems like a pretty relevant book to be reading, which is why you should all purchase it. You probably all did on the way in, yes? Anyone? Okay, you have time to purchase it afterwards, so please do. It is excellent, as I said, and I believe David will be signing copies of it on stage afterward. And of course, you can also check it out with your New York Public Library card, which surely everyone in this room has. You've both purchased the book and come with the library card to check out the book, I hope. All right, we'll see. And lastly, you got note cards when you came in with your programs. These are for asking questions. They'll be glad to take some questions at the end of the conversation. Write them down, and one of my colleagues will come by and pick them up during the chat. If you're watching online, you can put them in the YouTube chat, and we'll get them there as well. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isbahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and moreover by all of you here. So thank you very much for your support. Thank you for being here. And let's please give it up for Van Jones and David Oppenheimer.
Hello. Well, I'm glad to see everybody, and I'm especially glad to be here with a friend of mine. When I first got out of law school in 1993, I was an unemployable, left-wing radical with dreadlocks down my shoulders and clenched fists raised against society, and got some fellow travelers here. But I was very lucky to find a home at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights in San Francisco. Eva Jefferson Patterson, the great civil rights legend, hired me, and David was on the board. And so in some ways, this is my first boss. And when he let me know that he had written this incredible book that does such an extraordinary job of talking about diversity, not as some new pop, psych, woke thing, but is really a fundamental idea for 200 plus years that has now been proven scientifically to be impactful and important. I see you shaking your head, but you gotta listen to the argument first, brother. And the roots are incredibly deep. in our academic and Western traditions. And so it is just an honor to be here with you. I appreciate the incredible work and thoughtfulness you've put into this topic. This is not a political book, it's a historical book. And I would hope that my conservative friends who claim to like history and tradition would give it a fair hearing from one of our great historians. Give a round of applause to David Oppenheimer.
Thank you. Thank you, Van. It's a thrill to be here with you, to have watched you in your incredible career.
Oh, thank you, brother.
And to be talking about this topic with you. And it's a thrill to be at the Public Library in New York. I grew up here in New York, and this library played a very important role in my growing interest and love of scholarship.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, we were talking backstage about that a little bit. You did some of your original scholarship as a young kid with a fake mustache or not a good mustache, trying to sneak in here when you weren't really allowed. What is the diversity principle? Let's get this thing going.
Sure, thank you.
Especially since we've got some skeptics in the audience. I want you to.
Oh, good.
Yes, good. What is the diversity principle?
The diversity principle is that when we bring people together with different backgrounds and different experiences, including the experiences that they have had related to their age and to their religion, to their race and ethnicity, to their gender and disability and culture, and we include outsiders as well as insiders, they make better decisions.
That sounds woke.
Oh, well, in the original meaning of woke, to be awake, sure. But as ideology, it's not an ideological statement. It's a statement born of over 200 years of experience in higher education and more recently in the business world. It's been the subject of a great deal of scientific analysis and scientific research, and it's politically neutral, but it does mean that if we want the benefit of taking people who've been outsiders and including them as insiders, then there are important changes that we have to make that have been made ideological. I mean, the idea of human rights is not inherently ideological.
Sure. Well, let's just take a step back. You say that this idea has been a persistent idea and a persistent theme for 200 years. Can you go back and talk about who some of the path breakers were, names that have been somewhat lost a little bit in history, but some of them actually quite famous names that were the early pioneers 2 centuries ago in this idea about diversity?
Thank you. What I've done in this research is to find a chain of influence that began with Wilhelm von Humboldt, who is not a well-known figure among most Americans, but is the person who created the first modern research university, which was the University of Berlin in 1810. And that model has been so successful that every major university in the world today is described as a Humboldtian university because the foundation of the university is research, and research demands pushback, research demands conflict, and Humboldt, having seen that, included Catholics and Jews in a university that otherwise would have been all Protestant because that was the practice in Prussia in that era. And he said, no, we have to open the university. And that was a product very much of his experience, of his, all kinds of interesting life experiences, including a lot of connection with the arts through his wife, Caroline von Humboldt, one of the first art historians, one of the great figures. Goethe called Caroline von Humboldt the most interesting woman of her era. Okay, and that's no small praise from no small voice.
Small figure, yeah.
Yeah.
So you're saying that 200 years ago, this idea of diversity was used to stop the discrimination against Catholic scholars, stop the discrimination against Jewish scholars, and bring them into the university. And I guess, you know, some of our friends would say that was too woke and that was DEI. But we now live in a world that was created by that initial sort of explosion of diversity thinking. And it made the university better and not worse. Is that your argument?
Without Humboldt, universities would look very different. Science would look very different. Our views about conflict and the benefit of conflict, the benefit of the clash of ideas, would look very different because Humboldt was so important to universities generally and also in particular to John Stuart Mill and his lover of 25 years in this illicit relationship that was the scandal of its time, and then finally wife when her husband died, Harriet Taylor Mill. Their book, On Liberty, begins with a quotation from Humboldt about the importance of diversity. And all through On Liberty, there is this ongoing discussion about the value of diversity and the importance of diversity.
Now, I think part of the reason that this is such an important history to remember and to recall is because of how incredibly stultifying life was before these ideas. The rigidity, the groupthink, the enforced consensus, and the idea that, you know, this sort of, you know, polyamorous pairing, which we kind of always sweep that away when we talk about John Stuart Mill. These were weirdos. These were people doing weird stuff, and it was their insider and outsider status that had them fight for these ideas, and out of that comes much of the Western canon.
Yeah, Humboldt, who was the leading diplomat of his era in Prussia and enormously well respected, spent the last years of his life essentially in exile because of his opposition to anti-Semitism as Prussia and Germany became more and more anti-Semitic. The Mills were social outcasts, partly because of their relationship and partly because of how radical their ideas were. So yes, at every step, a price has been paid by the people who brought us this important idea.
And yet it would be almost impossible to imagine Western civilization over the past few centuries without the contribution of Mills and others. Why did you write this book?
Oh, you know, I'd love to give you some sort of highfalutin answer to that, but the truth is that I started the research because a colleague told me that I was being unserious about my critique of diversity. I was sort of sympathetic to Justice Thomas's view that diversity was simply about a preference of white liberals to have a few black faces in the room because as academics, it made us feel better, and that it was tokenism. And I said this to a colleague who said, if you're going to take that view, you need to research this more deeply. And so I started to do that, and whoa, the stuff I started coming up with was just amazing. I mean, there were such, I think, great stories. I mean, you know, who am I to say? Yes. But stories about people, in many cases, as you were saying, people who are famous people, but their role in this just hasn't been told.
Yeah, and I think I expected the book to be more polemical. It's actually just quite historical. You know, what surprised you the most in your research? As you kind of have the easy breezy skepticism of many, and then you start looking into it and you realize this idea is a more serious foundation for a lot of the things we like in the West. What surprised you the most? What are some of your surprises along the way?
This shouldn't have surprised me. But the role of a group of extraordinary women, starting in the 18th century and working their way all the way to the 21st, and how they connected over time, and the ideas that they brought that have been so suppressed because women's voices are so suppressed. And that's why I say it shouldn't have surprised me. But Caroline von Humboldt was enormously important in getting Wilhelm von Humboldt to see the world in a wider way, partly through their own gender and sexual experimentation. They had an open marriage. She persuaded him that he should invite her lovers to come and live with them. He himself expressed doubts about his gender orientation, asked friends to call him sister. All of this was her workings. Goethe was right in terms of how extraordinary she was. Harriet Taylor Mill, who has been...
You're doing a good job of reeling our conservative friends in until now. Anyway, but do carry on.
Well, Harriet Taylor Mill is clearly, it seems to me, clearly the co-author of much of John Stuart Mill's work. And for a while, during their lifetime, that was recognized. And he always said that she was his co-author. But then after he died and she died, that was just forgotten. And scholars just said, oh no, it was all the work of John Stuart Mill, because a woman couldn't have come up with these ideas. But her ideas were absolutely central to the ideas that he developed on liberty and on and on basic human rights and the importance of diversity, the importance of inclusion. She was just this major, unappreciated figure.
So you're pleasantly surprised to find so many strong women in your research. But look, you talk about how diversity used to bring in the Catholics and bring in the Jews. There are people who say, well, now the diversity is being used to castigate the Jews, push the Jews out, call them privileged, oppressors, colonizers. How do you reconcile this enthusiasm for diversity then with some of the practice of diversity now? Is diversity just DEI in your mind? Help me understand where we have arrived now in this conversation.
Well, diversity is not DEI. DEI is an attempt to put into practice the diversity principle, sometimes doing it very well and sometimes doing it very badly. It's not surprising that anti-Semitism exists in the world. We've seen 5,000 years of it. It's not surprising that diversity is used as a defense of anti-Semitism, because that's exactly what happened at Harvard in the 1920s and 1930s with the despicable Jewish quota that was imposed by Lowell Abbott and Abbott Lowell, excuse me. Lowell, Abbott. Lowell, who succeeded Charles Eliot, who was the great liberal builder of Harvard as a place devoted to diversity. When Lowell came in as president, the first thing he did was to kick the black students out of the dorms and out of the eating halls. Started an investigation to figure out which students were gay so that he could kick them out of Harvard, and became active in an anti-immigrant movement that would seem absolutely familiar today, was endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan and did not respond to that by asking that the Klan not endorse him. Ultimately was instrumental in inviting Nazi officials to visit Harvard in the 1930s. And he was the designer of the Jewish quota. And he said, we're doing this in order to have greater diversity. Well, that was crap, excuse me, using the technical term there. He was taking the ideas that Eliot had made central to Harvard and saying, in essence, to Eliot, okay, you're gonna support this idea of diversity? I'm gonna take your ideas and twist them so that you can be ashamed at the language you used.
So there's a double-edged sword here sometimes.
Yeah.
So that this idea of diversity, on the one hand, it has this sort of early provenance, and I certainly wouldn't be sitting here if it weren't for a great deal of successes, which we'll talk about. But there's also these different challenges. So let's get into that. So sometimes when people talk about the value of diversity, if you scratch beneath the surface, it just seems like they're talking about viewpoint diversity. At the end of the day, what they're saying is that people have different points of view. If you put them in a room together, come up with better solutions. And sometimes it seems like they're saying something more than that, which is that there's some special offering that comes from a particular kind of diversity, racial diversity, ethnic diversity, bless you, gender diversity, lifestyle diversity. So as we try to wrestle with this, I think some people might say, okay, well, I could agree with you that if the science shows that people have different points of view, if they get together, you don't have so much groupthink, you don't have so much consensus, that the clash of ideas. I might agree with you on that, but this race stuff, this gender stuff, now you've gone too far. How do you respond to that distinction in those critics?
I think I'd start with John Stuart Mill again, and a speech he made as the rector of St. Andrews back in 1865, when he said, we have to open the university to people with different viewpoints because the clash of ideas is so important to learning. And to get people with different viewpoints, we need people from different nations. We need people who have grown up in different circumstances. We need people with different experiences. It's true that viewpoint diversity is very important, but our viewpoints are influenced by our backgrounds and experiences. And let me point to one example that may seem counterintuitive. I'm a sometimes surprising admirer of opinions of Justice Thomas. And there's one in particular that I want to point to, and it's his dissenting opinion in Black v. Virginia. The 8 white members of the Supreme Court agreed that when the Klan burns a cross, that is a political statement, and it is at least potentially eligible for protection under the First Amendment, the idea of free speech. Thomas wrote an eloquent dissent in which he said, you don't understand the meaning of the burning of a cross. It is not a political statement, it is an act of intimidation and terrorism. I think it was his experience as a black man growing up in the South that allowed him to dissent from the view of the other 8 members of the court. And so, obviously, Justice Thomas is a very, very conservative figure. And he and I disagree most of the time, except in a certain area of civil procedure law, which I happen to teach, and so I'm sort of a fan in that area. But I think what's important is that he's bringing, the racial diversity he brings to the court, in some circumstances becomes very important in influencing his viewpoint diversity.
Well, you've done a good job of finding the one example.
How many do we need?
Exactly. Not so many for today. But what would you, listen, your same beloved Justice Thomas said, what did he say? He says at the Students for Fair Admissions, in that oral argument, he goes, what is this thing you call diversity? I'm not even sure I know what that means. What would you say to Justice Thomas if he were here now that you've plucked him up a little bit?
I would say, first of all, I'm so delighted to meet you again. And that, of course, as we know, diversity at its core means difference. And democracies value difference. And science values difference. And learning values difference.
But you have to listen. You have to double click on that. You seem to love this clash of ideas thing, this marketplace of ideas thing, and I think you might assume that everybody knows what you're talking about and everybody understands why it's so good. Why is this difference so good? Why is this clash so good? Why can't we all just get along? What are you talking about?
You know, growing up, I used to hear a phrase, "Great minds think alike." It's completely wrong. Great minds think differently, because when we're exposed to new ideas, we reevaluate. If we're open-minded, we reevaluate our own ideas. And our ideas are very much a reflection of our experience, of the lives we've lived. So when we have the value of being with people who see things differently than us, it helps us to better understand the world, sometimes to change our views, sometimes to convince them to change their views, often to find commonalities. And look, this is what you do so effectively on CNN when you're in those roundtables with people, some of whom you disagree with quite a bit, but it's great. It's great to see you disagreeing with them and to see that whole diversity of viewpoint, which again I think is very much a reflection of experience and background.
Listen, I agree with you more than you know. Had I not been at CNN, when I left the Obama administration, I could have gone to MSNBC, or I could have gone to Fox. By the time CNN was sort of more in the middle. As a result of going there, I arrived at this moment where you had at CNN, you had the great David Gergen on the right, you had Newt Gingrich on the right, you had James Carville on the left, Paul Begala on the left, Donna Brazile on the left, and I was this new kid there, and to watch these folks with great respect in those days, we didn't have the kind of stuff we have now on cable news, with great respect, really, really go at it, and not just on set, but also in the green room, and sometimes in the elevator, and sometimes in the parking lot. So, I'm a different person.
Yeah.
Because I was exposed to the best thinking from so many different parts of the country. And so when the time came when I was able to work with the Trump administration and the 1.0 version of that on criminal justice reform, I told Jared Kushner, I said, with you, Jared Kushner's father had gone to federal prison, and he wanted to do something about federal prisons. I said, Jared, with you, I got 99 problems, but prisons ain't one. To quote a little bit of Jay-Z. But I was capable of working across those lines because I had a TV show called Crossfire with Newt Gingrich, and we worked across those lines. And there's a capacity you develop as a citizen when you're forced to be exposed to people who think differently, who love differently, who pray differently, who grew up differently. And that capacity, I think, is key for democracy. And I think that the fact that we've retreated into these little bubbles, so where everybody's kind of atrophied in their ability to listen, is actually making the country a lot more brittle, a lot weaker, and a lot dumber. And yet, this idea that you're championing is very controversial. Help us understand how we got to this place where, you have to take some risks to even raise your hand and say you're for diversity now. And our friend here shook his head as soon as you mentioned the title of your book. How did this noble idea wind up in such a thicket?
Well, I think that underlying the idea that diversity has value is that there has to be an effort to make room for outsiders.
Outsiders.
And we live in a society which has been dominated by white men. And if white men have to make room for women in positions of leadership, for black Americans in positions of leadership, for other people of color in positions of leadership, for people with different gender identities, that reduces their power and their comfort level. There was a great piece in the Harvard Business Review about how much more comfortable corporate leaders are when there's minimal diversity in the leadership of the company and in the boardroom. It's just a more comfortable place. The problem is it's a much less successful place in terms of the goals of the business, because there is this, what we call sometimes a cultural fit. A cultural fit is not a good thing. A cultural fit means that people are just sort of going along with how they've always done things. They're not being forced to confront new ideas.
Well, you know, I liked your position a lot more when I was younger. Now that I'm older, I have to hire these younger people who I don't understand at all and who get on my nerves. And I realize, you know, I'm in my late 50s now, and there's a new guard coming. And I have a little bit more sympathy now that I feel like I'm losing my place. I used to be the cool young kid at CNN, and now I'm the old guy.
No.
And
now you are the revered older voice, and they look to you for mentorship.
Yeah.
And let them in.
Look, here's what I would say. Just as a Democrat, as a progressive, as a liberal, I think you're asking people to do something that's harder than we admit. Mm-hmm. I think that most people don't see themselves as privileged at all. If they're white, if they're male, if they're straight, if they're whatever it is, most people's self-narrative is, I'm a kid from somewhere trying to get somewhere.
That's right.
And I had to fight to get what I got. It wasn't handed to me. And I think when you challenge that, one should certainly challenge it gingerly. And I do think that progressives have collapsed a few distinctions that make our job harder and make it harder for people to listen to us. One is, everything's not privilege. A privilege is an unearned advantage, which we all have. The greatest unearned advantage, by the way, is being an American citizen. You're not a genius for that, but because you're an American citizen, that passport is pretty daggum valuable. So everybody in here has some level of unearned privilege. But then there's something called earned success. Every straight white guy didn't make it, and the ones that did feel like, hey, listen, I had some privilege, but I also earned some success. And I think when we don't acknowledge that earned success, you know, I'm a straight white guy, I've got a cousin who's on drugs. I'm here doing this. Where's my honor for the effort I made? I think we miss opportunities. And then lastly, I think there's a question of entitlement, which is a sin from above or below. If you have, quote unquote, made it and you think you don't owe anybody anything and you're the bee's knees, that's called entitlement. And you often engage in abuses of power. That sucks. But there's also, if you are one of the have-nots and feel woe is me and everybody owes me something without effort, which can happen, that's also entitlement of a different kind and can result in abuses of powerlessness, where you say, because I'm a victim, I have no responsibility for my own life. And so I think that privilege, success, entitlement, these are different things. And I think that sometimes the way we talk about them leave people who might be somewhat sympathetic feeling unseen, unheard, unwelcome, and that can maybe disserve the cause of diversity.
Well, I think I think everything you've said is fair. And I think that what we need to balance that with is, if we're going to recognize, as we should, people's success, if we're going to celebrate people's success, we also want those of us who've been successful to recognize, one, that we didn't do it alone, that it took an entire society to help us with our success, gain our success, and two, that there are some for whom success is much, much harder for reasons that are fundamentally unfair, and that as a result, if we just talk about enlightened self-interest, we are suppressing ideas, we are suppressing opportunity, we are hurting our society. And so we need, particularly those who've been successful, need to figure out how to break down barriers to success so that others can share in that success, and need to recognize that there is disadvantage that gets tied to race. There is disadvantage that gets tied to gender or sex. Those things are not made up. They are very real.
I've talked to a couple people, and I've seen circulating on Instagram or something. I don't spend any time on social media except all my time. And so, and there was someone who was saying, a good white conservative brother, saying that he had adopted a black child from Ethiopia and was shocked, Jamie, stunned, Jamie, to find out that his black child was being treated very differently than his white children. Now, this, and he was confessing that, you know, still a strong conservative, but that this experience of sending his child, he has these white kids that are you know, his kids, and he also has adopted this black kid, and that this kid is having such a different experience. This kid's actually smarter than the other kids, he says. More curious, but radically different experience, and he says it shocked him. And then he realized that some of these things he's been kind of, it's just special pleading and bitching and moaning from these, you know, lazy black people who just want stuff and want to somehow hurt me. He's like, And what's so interesting that he said was that it's the overreaction. If his black kid does something well, oh my God, it's amazing. No, she's just doing basic math. Just like every other kid here. You don't get the Nobel Prize for doing basic math. This overreaction to something good. But then anything bad, this overreaction. Oh my God, this child is violent and dangerous. So that the child just can't be a child because people are doing these weird things. And this is in 2006. And since I have no credibility as a black liberal, this is a white conservative pointing out that these disadvantages are still here with us. And so we have to figure out something to do about it. But what I like about your point, that sounds charitable. We should do something because these people are being mistreated, and we should try to help them be treated better. You're making a different point. You're saying selfishly, if you want to have a team that can win, if you want to have a business that's going to be profitable, you need to have viewpoint, and you would say gender, and you would say ethnic, and you would say racial diversity, because even though it may be less comfortable, because of that discomfort, the team is going to be stronger and smarter.
That's exactly right.
But defend that, because, look, I don't like having all these weird young people in my staff.
Well, the defense comes from the science. You know, when Humboldt came up with this idea, when the Mills liked this idea, when Thurgood Marshall debated this idea with Pauli Murray, and Pauli Murray convinced him of this idea, it was all kind of theory. It was all hunch. But now we've got thousands of studies by psychologists, by economists, by sociologists who have looked at the question of whether racial diversity, ethnic diversity, gender diversity, whether all of these different kinds of diversity matter in terms of success. And the answer, not every time, but most of the time, is yes. It makes a big difference.
Well, then why not just leave it to the market then, and just let the smart people that hire all the left-handed lesbians or whatever beat the people who don't? Why all this social engineering?
Yeah.
Pisses everybody off.
That was the position that President Eisenhower took with regard to the civil rights movement and the proposed civil rights laws of the 1960s. And he said, people of goodwill will not discriminate, and companies will be convinced that discrimination is not in their interest, and therefore what we need is a commitment by business to voluntarily not discriminate rather than anti-discrimination law. That's still the view in many parts of Europe, although it's in conflict with European law. I'm going to go down the wrong road. I'm sorry.
Stay here in the U.S.
Yeah, sorry.
America first.
Yeah,
right?
that's right. That's right. And the answer is that because people are comfortable, because white people are more comfortable in a white environment, because men are more comfortable if the other people in leadership are men, that even if there is enlightened self-interest that says you should be more diverse, they're willing to sacrifice a certain amount of that success in the interest of their comfort, in the interest of their cultural fit.
Yeah, I think it's important to point that out because there are lots of interests at play when anyone makes a decision. No one makes a purely economically rational decision. No, people don't make rational decisions in general. Otherwise, we'd all be flossing like the Dickens and all kind of stuff we don't do. So, but you know, you ran by a name, Pauli Murray.
Pauli Murray.
Which I think you would be angry with me if I allowed you to rush past that name, given the incredible esteem in which you hold Pauli Murray. Who is Pauli Murray?
Pauli Murray. Let me say, for 40 years, I told my students that the greatest lawyer of the 20th century was Thurgood Marshall. I now tell my students that the second greatest lawyer of the 20th century was Thurgood Marshall, because the greatest lawyer of the 20th century is someone who, how many of you have heard of Pauli Murray? Okay, a few hands, good, glad to see that. Pauli Murray was a queer black woman who was rejected by the University of North Carolina because she was black, and then after finishing first in her class at Howard Law School, which entitled her to attend Harvard for a PhD program on a full scholarship, rejected by Harvard because she was a woman, she convinced Thurgood Marshall to rethink his approach to the desegregation cases leading to Brown v. Board of Education. So that's one. Two, she theorized how the 14th Amendment should apply to sex discrimination, and then took the leading role at the ACLU of hiring Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and with her wrote the briefs that convinced the court that sex discrimination violates the 14th Amendment. Three, when the US Senate was about to amend the proposed '64 Civil Rights Act to eliminate the ban on sex discrimination in employment, she went to Lady Bird Johnson and convinced her to go to Lyndon Johnson, who convinced the Senate to retain the ban on sex discrimination. Four, she theorized a whole theory of private discrimination under the 13th Amendment that was dismissed as ridiculous in the 1940s and adopted by the Supreme Court in the 1960s. And then, at the top of an extraordinary legal career, left the law to become an Episcopal priest at a time when women weren't allowed to become priests. But that's okay, by the time she graduated from the seminary, they were. And she has been sainted by, or deified, whatever the right verb is, by the Episcopal Church. And the book that I'm starting working on right now is called Pauli Murray's Legal Legacy.
Well, I think we could give a round of applause to Pauli Murray. That's,
Yeah.
Look, we've got some cards from folks with questions, so I'm going to pick the ones I like, so give me a second.
When we get to the very end,
Yes.
I want to save 1 minute to talk about another black woman who people should know about, and that's Carla Hayden. Okay?
Do it right now. Do it right now.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, okay.
We're all friends here.
Here we are in one of the great libraries of the world. 7 years ago, I think it was 7 years ago, President Obama appointed Carla Hayden as the Librarian of Congress. Under the statute passed by Congress, that's a 10-year term. She, a black woman, grew up on the south side of Chicago, started working in libraries as a volunteer, reading to autistic children, ultimately earned a PhD in library science from the University of Chicago, became a professor of library science at the University of Pittsburgh, returned to Chicago to run the Chicago Public Library, and then to Baltimore to run the Baltimore Public Library, elected president of the American Library Association, and then again appointed by President Obama as the Librarian of Congress, confirmed by the Senate for a 10-year term, first woman and first black American to hold that position, fired in the first few weeks of the Trump administration by email, with the email saying, "Dear Carla," not dear Dr. Hayden, "Dear Carla, we don't need your services anymore." And when the press office was asked why she had been fired, the explanation was her support for DEI meant that she was putting inappropriate books on the shelves at the Library of Congress, inappropriate for children, because books about LGBT people that children shouldn't have access to by just going to the library shelves. Well, here's the thing. The Library of Congress doesn't have shelves. It doesn't have a children's section. You have to be 16 to use the library, and then you use it as a research library. There are no open shelves where you can go around and pick out a book. It was simply a series of lies about this extraordinarily talented black woman, done because the Trump administration felt that any time you can say that someone was a supporter of diversity or a supporter of DEI, that justified firing them. And she's one of any number of black women to whom they've done that.
Well, I appreciate you celebrating her, and I'm starting to suspect that the Trump administration isn't as much of a fan of diversity as you. I'm beginning to suspect.
That's fair.
I don't want to jump to conclusions.
They should be.
Yes. So we got some great questions. We will not get to all of them, unfortunately, but in the 10 minutes that we have left, let's try to get through a few. Here's a tough one. If diversity is such a bedrock of universities, why have they become such monocultures? Now, I think what that person may be saying, and I don't mean to speak for you, is that in the name of diversity, there's been a real bulldozing of more conservative views, perhaps, more views that are more skeptical of the liberal project. There does seem to be, I guess when we were back in the 90s, they call it, PC orthodoxy on these campuses. If diversity is such a bedrock of universities, why have they become such monocultures?
A good and fair question, and I want to break into two parts. Because one, I think that the hostility toward conservative ideas at universities and colleges is a serious problem. We have to find room for conservative voices. We have to find room for voices that challenge our views. Although I think that universities and colleges are not as, what was the word? Monocultural as the author of the question thinks. I think that there is a wide diversity of viewpoint from sort of far left to center. But what's missing, well, that's important because there's a big difference between how a centrist sees the world and how a traditional liberal and how a more progressive and how a radical. These are different viewpoints. But there is a group of voices that are missing, and I think it's a problem.
That's good. I think that's fair. Do you believe there should be a common core of beliefs for otherwise diverse Americans to be cohesive?
I don't know about a common core of beliefs. I think there should be a common core of reading. I think we should all be exposed broadly to our history. I think that there should be exposure to a variety of beliefs, but I don't think we all have to believe the same thing.
You know, it's interesting because I think this is a big difference between conservatives and liberals. You know, if the founders said, you know, they believe in e pluribus unum, out of many one, I think liberals are really big on the pluribus, not so big on the unum. And I think the conservatives are really big on the unum and not so big on the pluribus. And so, you know, I do think it, taken to its logical extreme, it's hard to cohere a country if there isn't something that we all hold dear. And I think that if we leave it to only conservatives to defend that common core, I think it probably weakens the liberal cause and weakens the country. Do you see it differently?
Well, I take your point. I think it's important that people care about their community. I think it's important that people have compassion. I think, again, an understanding of a shared history is important in terms of our being a people. But I also think there's an awful lot of room for diversity and for disagreement and difference while still having a nation and a people.
You're a pluribus guy. I get it.
You're right. Yeah. You're not surprised.
I'm not surprised. Known you for 30 years. To what extent, more than that, to what extent should we tolerate intolerance? I think this is a tough challenge from the left that says, how does your diversity of ideas, acceptance of diversity, how does that extend to dissent that comes from people who are just intolerant of this whole project and other people and people who are different? How do you manage that with your diversity, love diversity? Do you love these diverse bigots? I mean, where are you?
Well, yeah, we have to tolerate a fair degree of intolerance. It doesn't mean we can't point it out. It doesn't mean we can't say, this is wrong, this is fundamentally wrong. And there are times when intolerance is so hurtful that we have to speak out against it, and that we have to say there's a problem with what's happening here. But we also have to recognize that there's got to be room for a lot of disagreement, including, you know, long tails left and right of people who say things that just seem ridiculous.
Look, companies often say that diversity slows things down. This is the flip side of your disdain for this argument about cultural fit. But you've got companies, they're racing against China, trying to build AI, quantum computing, biotech, et cetera. These are tough fields with stiff competition. And what they'll tell you, you know, away from the microphone is, you know, we just start dumping in all kind of people from all kind of places, it's going to slow us down. How do you respond to that? Does the data show that? I mean, what's your value proposition when cultural fit does help accelerate?
The data doesn't support that assertion. What the data show us is that companies that have greater diversity in their leadership, both in the C-suite and in the boards, are more successful. But there's an ongoing question about whether we're talking about causation or whether we're simply recognizing that more diverse companies are more successful without being able to prove that it's because of their diversity. But the evidence nonetheless supports the conclusion that these things go together. It's not that companies with more cultural fit and less diversity are more successful. That's just not what the data show us.
No, what I've seen is that people go a lot faster sometimes into a brick wall, or they go faster down the wrong road, and so we're in danger of having a country with an awful lot of data and very little wisdom. And I think that's a big, big danger from our friends in the tech world.
Well, with the attacks on science, we're at risk of not even having much data.
Yeah,
I mean, it's extraordinary, the assault on science that is occurring in this administration, and the much of it directed at diversity and the idea of diversity, but even more broadly, just a skepticism, serious skepticism about the benefits of scientific inquiry. That's a terribly, terribly dangerous thing.
I'm starting to suspect you didn't vote for Trump.
You know, I grew up in an era when you weren't supposed to say who you voted for. That was part of the idea of a secret ballot.
Yeah, I think you may have left a few clues tonight. What does your ideal, this is probably the last question. There's a lot of great questions, and I wish we could get to all of them, but we'll do two more. What does your ideal version of the diversity principle applied look like? In other words, what model, current or historic, reflects your vision?
Oh, nobody has achieved it. Yeah, I mean, nobody has achieved it. And there are lots of examples in colleges and universities. There are lots of examples in companies in this country where there has been an attempt to create greater diversity. And those have come up against roadblocks in the past few years with the Trump administration. And with others. It's not just the Trump administration, but this resistance to the idea that there are benefits that flow from diversity. But nobody's gotten there.
So somebody asked me a question, which I felt good about. All the other questions are for you.
I'm sorry.
Very bad for my self-esteem. 27 questions for you.
Let's do this with your next book. We'll do it again. Okay.
I think that's fair.
I'd love that.
I think that's fair. But it's a decent question. It says, Van, I've always admired your skill in listening to people, even when you disagree. Polarization makes that harder to do. How have you been able to continue to do so? And what I would say about that is, we kind of came up in a different time. At the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, where you were, one of my bosses. I don't mean to glorify those days, but our expectation was that the people who were on the other side were human beings, that they were people with points of view and interests that we were going to have to take seriously when we were getting ready to go into litigation or whatever else. But there wasn't this idea then that they were demons and we were saints. It just wasn't, the culture wasn't that. And I think that, for me, when I'm on set, with someone, like, my good friend Scott Jennings, a lot more head shaking on that one, brother. No, but he is a friend, and we've been on TV together for 12 years. When he's talking, I drop my diaphragm really low, just physically. I don't want to get tense and stop breathing, because when you stop breathing, your brain goes into fight, flight, freeze, and you stop thinking creatively. You can't really hear. So I've learned to drop my diaphragm really low. I've learned to want to hear the other point of view, to see it as valuable. I already know what I think. I already know how I feel. I try to see him as a portal into a set of information, arguments, emotional realities that I don't have access to kind of see this as a moment for me to understand something that I wouldn't otherwise understand, to have access to something I wouldn't ordinarily have access to. And so I've changed my mental state when he's talking. And I'm trying to figure out actually where can I find some agreement, because I know where I'm going to find the disagreement. But I found that if I can point out the point where actually that's a good point, I hadn't thought about that, that makes sense to me. But when I then make the intervention, it lands better, it lands different. It seems like there's a dialogue happening. And I just think we've lost that art. And I think that we'll get the benefit from diversity more when we actually aren't, like, I don't like Scott Jennings in spite of the fact that he's a conservative apologist for Donald Trump. I like him because he is that. I need that. It's incomprehensible to me. And yet to him, it's more obvious. And I think if we could somehow get back to saying, I'm excited to meet someone who's different. I'm excited to see someone who thinks about it differently. I'm excited to hear it. And, you know, and I'm not going to change my mind about it, but I'm excited. That seems to be a lost art.
I think you've just put it so perfectly. I just couldn't agree more. I think that's right. Let's, yeah.
Oh, thank you, brother. That's good. Hey, listen. But before we give this man his long-deserved applause, I want you to look at that tablet. I want you to make sure there's nothing on that piece of paper that you haven't hit, your pad, because you wrote down a bunch of stuff you wanted to make sure we talked about. And if there's any one name on there, because this is a book of incredible human beings, if there's any one other person you want to brag on it right now. We'll take 2 more minutes.
For those of you who have an interest in legal history, I think you'll find that the connection between the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and the movement for diversity-based affirmative action in the US is a fascinating relationship. And the idea that a university should have, as part of its academic freedom, the right to select its students with an eye toward including a racially diverse student body because of the benefits of diversity, in many ways originated in the anti-apartheid movement of South Africa.
Well, Nelson Mandela, one of the greats, that movement, one of the greats, and David Oppenheimer, one of the greats.
Oh, please.
One of the greats.
Thank you.
So, it's awesome. So, I'll take it.
Yeah, really.
Hey, so this book is for sale. We're going to be out here signing them. Please buy the book. He's got a set of twins that are no longer as little as they were when I met him, but they still probably ask him for stuff. So we'll see you out there, and thank you again very much.
Thank you.